Okay, hi everybody. This is a re-recording of the Benchmark Appraisal Group's USPAP Extravaganza Part 1 that was originally presented on October 26th. However, as a first attempt to record some of these little webinars that we're doing in-house, I had a technical difficulty with the audio, and therefore the original recording, none of the audio came through. And therefore I am doing a quick re-record of part 1 so that we can keep the information in our library and keep everything up to date. But anyway, this is Benchmark's USPAP Extravaganza Part 1, where we take a deeper dive into the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, or USPAP. Just to let you know, this presentation is being made for informational purposes only. To provide additional information on USPAP to our staff and try to dive a little deeper into some topics that might not be covered during a normal 15-hour or 17-hour USPAP course. One of the reasons why we're here doing this is not just a refresher of the concepts that are presented in the Appraisal Qualification Board's 15-hour or 7-hour USPAP courses. What our intention is to dive a little deeper in the concepts that we need to consider in our everyday work, and also to provide a bilateral opportunity to ask questions and share opinions that you might not otherwise be able to have answered during an online continuing education course. Also, we hope that these informational sessions will help us do our job better, and it will also eliminate the "well, I didn't knows." Paying attention here, you should be able to have a little bit better idea of how to perform, or to complete these appraisal reports in a manner where the reports are USPAP compliant, and be a little bit more knowledgeable about the work that we perform on a daily basis. Just as a quick refresher, our first question we're going to ask is, what is USPAP? And in short, USPAP represents the generally accepted and recognized standards of appraisal practice in the United States. This is basically the bare minimum requirements for how to perform an appraisal report, or what needs to be disclosed within an appraisal report. It was basically developed back in 1986, 1987 by an ad hoc committee on uniform standards and copyrighted in 1987. The effective date of the original USPAP was published April 27th, 1987, which was actually before FIREA. Major misconception is that USPAP was created as a result of FIREA, but actually USPAP was in the works well before then. It was first actually adopted by major appraisal organizations, but this was also during the time before appraisers were required to have state licenses. So now however, now it's actually governed by the Appraisal Standards Board, which was established in 1989. And as we all know, USPAP is actually a living document that gets changed and updated, and USPAP is actually updated every 2 years. Next, we always touch on the different sections of USPAP, and during the next several sessions, we're going to go into these a little bit more in depth, but just to give you an idea, there's the preamble, there's definitions, there are 5 rules within USPAP, there's 10 standards. Generally what we handle as appraisers, as real estate appraisers, we deal with standard 1, which is the development of a real estate appraisal report, and standard 2, which is the reporting options of an appraisal report. A lot of times, sometimes we may get into standards 3 and standards 4, which basically handle an appraisal review, the development of an appraisal review, and the reporting of an appraisal review. And an appraisal review is defined as the analysis of another appraiser's work. There's also statements included in the USPAP, but currently there are no statements in this edition of USPAP. Therefore, we're not really going to be touching over that much. And then there's other communications which are not technically part of USPAP, but are included within the literature. And these are often known as the advisory opinions and the frequently asked questions. Today we're going to kind of just touch on the preamble as an introduction, and we're going to dive a little deeper into two terms that we hear quite often in the appraisal business: credibility and the term misleading. And we're going to discuss we're going to dive a little deeper into how intended use is a direct relationship of the term credibility, and intended user has a direct relationship to what would be considered misleading. And finally, we're going to touch on what's commonly known as the dirty dozen. It's actually now the dirty 14 because there's a couple extra items that were added. But these are basically the 12 items that are required to be included in every appraisal assignment with no exceptions. It does not matter if your appraisal is being presented within a restricted format. It doesn't matter if it's presented as an appraisal, and it doesn't matter even if it's presented as an oral appraisal. These are 14 items which have to be in the report in order to make your appraisal report USPAP compliant. First, we're going to touch on the preamble, and basically the preamble is the very first page, very first sentence, very first paragraph of USPAP, and it basically discusses that the purpose of the Uniform Standards Professional Appraisal Practice is to promote and maintain a high level of public trust in appraisal practice by establishing requirements for appraisers. It is essential that appraisers develop and communicate their analysis, opinions, and conclusions to intended users of their services in a manner that is meaningful and not misleading. All right, there's a few sections here that are highlighted, and the first one is no matter what appraisal course you take, the whole purpose of the Uniform Standards Professional Appraisal Practice is to promote and maintain a high level of public trust. Now, then we also talk about who we are communicating our analysis to, and that would be the intended users. And when you're talking about the fact that it needs to be presented in a manner that's meaningful and not misleading, we need to know that it's the intended users that we're responsible for providing the meaningful and not misleading results to. So in reality, the Uniform Standards Professional Appraisal Practice provides minimum standards. These are the bare minimum of what's expected from an appraiser when performing your duties. There are two terms that are emphasized throughout USPAP, as mentioned before. One is to develop the analysis in a manner that the results are in a credible assignment, develop analysis in a manner that results in credible assignment results, and to develop and communicate their analysis, opinions, and conclusions to the intended users in a manner that is meaningful and not misleading. So our deeper dive today, we're going to go into what does USPAP mean by credible and not misleading. Okay, well, the first thing you do is you look at the definition of credible. Credible is defined in USPAP as worthy of belief. And the credible assignment results require support by relevant evidence and logic to the degree necessary for the intended use. And this is where the relationship between credibility and intended use comes into play. It's important to know that credibility is judged in the context of intended use. So therefore, if you want to know whether your results and your presentation are credible, then you need to have a good understanding of what the intended use of the appraisal is, because a analysis that's developed and reported for one intended use may actually not be sufficient enough for a separate use. The intended use establishes a benchmark for what is appropriate for the scope of work and appropriate level of the detail of the report. And as we mentioned, credibility is relative. It's not an absolute. So the assignment results that are deemed credible for one intended use may not be credible for another intended use. And we're going to take a look at a couple different illustrations of a similar assignment, but because of the intended use and also somewhat the intended users, the amount of work or the scope of work may change due to the requirement in order to make sure that your appraisal assignment is credible. So in illustration 1, they talk about it that a homeowner calls an appraiser and asks for a valuation of his property. The owner wants to determine how much equity he has in the property. The owner is content to know the market value in the form of a range of values. He doesn't want to pay for a written report or the time involved in a property inspection. The owner does not intend to share the assignment results with the lender, because the owner knows the lender will order a new appraisal when the loan application's been submitted. So what level of development and reporting would be required to arrive at a credible value conclusion? Well, a lot of those things, if the property owner is the one who's asking for the assignment and he's the only person that's going to be relying on the results of the assignment, is it necessary to have a 6-page dissertation on the layout and finishes of the property? Well, a lot of people would say, no, you don't need that when you're dealing with the owner, because that owner probably knows more about the interior or the finishes or the layout of the property than anybody else would, and probably even more so than the appraiser would. So in order to have a credible valuation result, that might not be required if the only person using that appraisal assignment is the owner of the property. However, in illustration number 2, the next week, a lender calls for an appraisal for a drive-by appraisal on the same property in connection with a home equity loan. The lender is happy with the owner's credit rating and plans to keep the loan in their portfolio. The lender sees very little risk in the transaction and seeks the appraiser's opinion of the property's market value based on exterior inspection only. So what level of development and reporting would be required to achieve credible value conclusion? And would the scope of work performed by the appraiser based on illustration 1 be credible here? And I'm sure you probably already realized that the answer to that is probably no, because the intended use of the appraisal report is for mortgage lending purposes. They probably would not accept a value range as the final conclusion. They would probably need an actual pinpointed number because of the risk tolerance of the intended user and the parameters of the intended use. They would be able to get away with accepting an exterior only observation or an exterior only inspection, and the description of the property would probably need to be a little bit more thorough. The market analysis would probably need to be a little bit more thorough, as the underwriters or the banks who are reading this appraisal report are probably maybe not in the exact same location as the property, and they might need a little better understanding of what's going on in the market, whereas the owner who lives in a certain neighborhood probably already knows more about what's going on in the neighborhood than somebody who's outside of the neighborhood. And then you have illustration number 3, where 7 months later, an attorney for the owner's wife asks the appraiser for an appraisal on the same property because the owners are getting a divorce. The attorney needs the appraiser to conduct a thorough inspection of the home and provide an in-depth study of the sales and comparable homes in the market, making sure to verify the sales information with the buyers, real estate agents, the county records office. The attorney wants the appraiser's report to contain a complete and exhaustive description of the subject property, the comparable properties, and the analysis leading to the appraiser's opinion. Well, what level of development and reporting would be required to arrive at a credible value conclusion? And would the scope of work performed in assignments based on illustrations 1 and 2 be credible here? Well, obviously, the intended use of this one is there's a little bit more discrepancy. They might have to, have a better support for why a property would sell for a certain value or a certain price, or what the value of the property would be. Where in the illustration for the owner, they really only wanted a value range, and the use of the bank only required an exterior-only inspection with a brief summary of what's going on in the market. So I hope these illustrations show you that as the use of the report changes, you may be required to provide additional information, additional research, ranging anywhere from what's the ballpark range of what houses are selling for in this market, to we need to have a really good idea of exactly what adjustments are warranted to the sales and what the exact probable sales price for the subject property would be, as we would see in illustration number 3. So the importance of intended use is, if you don't have a thorough understanding of intended use in the development and reporting process, it could actually contribute to errors of excess or errors of deficiency. If you were to provide the attorney-client with the same development process and report that the appraiser performed for the owner or the lender, it would be a deficiency because you're not satisfying their intended use. On the other hand, providing the homeowner with the same level of development and reporting required by the attorney would be considered excessive. In both cases, the appraiser failed to provide reports that are meaningful and relative to their intended use. But a lot of times we also hear in the process that, I perform my appraisal analyses the same way no matter who I'm performing the appraisal report for. And that's actually a good business practice to have. But once again, as we mentioned, USPAP provides the bare minimum of what's required by appraisers. And one thing we need to understand is that many times normal business practice far exceeds the minimum requirements of USPAP. So there are times where we're going to develop a appraisal report based on, the amount of information in development which we believe is required in order to develop credible results. So make sure that whether you're performing an appraisal for the homeowner, whether you're performing it for a lender, or whether you're performing it for an attorney, you always need to make sure that you're developing the appraisal report and reporting the appraisal report in such that the result is going to be credible based on the intended use of the property. And next we talk about the term misleading. And the most important part of that is page 1, paragraph 1 of the preamble specifically states that it's essential that the appraiser develops and communicates her analysis, opinions, and conclusions to intended users for their services in a manner that is meaningful and not misleading. And this is very important because most of the time when a individual or an appraiser is accused of being misleading, there may be it may be unsure as to who the report was misleading to. And a lot of times when these reports are developed and reported, we have to make sure that the intended user is the one who's receiving the meaningful results. And next, we talk about the difference between a client and intended user. A client is actually the individual who engages the appraiser, and an intended user is anybody else that might rely upon that appraisal report that's being developed. And the client is always an intended user, but the intended user is not always the client, because many times there's going to be people who rely upon the appraisal report who are not the individual who actually engages the services of the appraiser. An example of that could be that a certain bank may be the one who engages the appraiser, but yet the Small Business Association or the FHA may rely upon that appraisal report. The FHA or SBA would be considered an additional intended user, but they would not be considered the client. And this is why it's very important to have a strong understanding of knowing who the intended users are at the time of the engagement is so that the report can be developed and presented in a way that all the intended users will be able to understand and comprehend the results, the development and the results of the appraisal report. And that's why USPAP is so adamant as to if the intended users change during the course of the assignment, it actually constitutes a new assignment as the way the original assignment may have been developed and reported may not be sufficient for the new intended user. So as mentioned before, the client is the party or individuals or group that engages the appraiser. The intended user, the client, is the client and any other party as identified by name or type as users of the appraisal or appraisal review report by the appraisal based on the communication with the client at the time of the assignment. As mentioned before, the client is always an intended user. The intended user is not always the client. And key points to know is that in an appraisal report, the intended users can be identified by name or type. However, in a restricted appraisal report, because it's such a limited scope of presentation and it's basically a Cliff Note version of an appraisal report, the intended users must be identified by specific name, not type. And when we mean that, we mean, XYZ Bank or John Doe, not owner of the property or future lender or participant in a loan. And why is it so important? An appraiser must establish with the client a clear and mutual understanding of the needs of all intended users. That's why they need to be disclosed at the time of the engagement. And it helps the appraiser identify the appropriate scope of work for the appraisal and a level of detail to provide in the report. Also, it ensures that the client and any other intended users can recognize their relationship to the assignment. And more importantly, it ensures that the parties who are not intended users will not be misled or notify them, or by notifying them that they're neither the client nor an intended user. So this is important at times where the property owner may get a copy of, or may request an appraisal, and then they submit that appraisal to be used for either a tax appeal or mortgage financing, because of the fact that the other individuals were not listed as intended users. That should be assigned to those individuals and organizations. That the appraisal report may not have been reported in a way that might be required for them to have a credible and non-misleading view of the assignment results. And then there's also other parties as well. What if the client gives a copy of the report to a third party? Well, the parties who receive a copy of the appraisal are not automatically intended users unless the appraiser specifically identifies them at the time of the assignment based on communication with the client. And if there are multiple intended users, it may impact the scope of work. As we mentioned before, as an example, the assignment includes the VA, FHA, or SBA as intended users and may impact the development of the reporting requirements, because each of those organizations may have their own requirements of what they need in an appraisal report in order to make their lending decisions. And it's up to the appraiser to know at the time of the engagement that information needs to be included. And finally, today we're going to go over a quick summary of the Dirty Dozen. And basically, these are now 14 items, which represents the bare minimum content for a USPAP-compliant appraisal report. And when we talk about USPAP-compliant appraisal reports, one thing we need to mention is that the reports are USPAP-compliant. The appraisers are not. The way the USPAP defines it is that the reports or the reporting option is what is deemed as in compliance with USPAP. And these are the 14 items that are required in every appraisal report in order to meet that minimum requirement. Before we get started on them, there's a couple of bonus items. And the first one is to prominently state the USPAP reporting option used. And ever since 2014, there's only 2 reporting options that are recognized by USPAP. And that's an appraisal report and a restricted appraisal report. The work file requirements state that you have enough information in your work file to replicate an appraisal report, regardless of which report was written as part of the assignment. A lot of times, and even still, we will see some antiquated appraisal reporting options indicated. Back in 2005 or 2006, there used to be a term called either a limited or a complete appraisal report. Those just basically determine what the scope of work, which methods of evaluation were used. That was actually retired by USPAP in the early 2000s. And then also prior to 2014, there were 3 options. One was a restricted use appraisal report, one was a summary appraisal report, and one was a self-contained appraisal report. And due to the ambiguity of those types of reports, USPAP basically tourniquet those reporting options and summarize them into either an appraisal report or a restricted appraisal report while retiring the self-contained, the summary, and the restricted use options. However, a lot of times we still see clients ordering appraisals based on the prior definitions and the prior names. So it's definitely up to us as appraisers to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what it is the clients are looking for prior to the engagement. Number one, you basically have to, the first thing you have to make sure you include in the appraisal report is you have to state the identity of the client. And that's the individual who or entity that engages the services of the appraiser. And if the client requests anonymity, you must state the identity you must state that the identity is withheld at the client's request, but is retained in the appraiser's work file. So even though in the report you don't disclose who the client is, you do need to make sure that in your work file you have documentation of who ordered the appraisal report. Number 2 is to state the identity of any other intended users. As we mentioned before, in an appraisal report, it can be either by specific name or by type of user. However, in a restricted appraisal report, it has to be by name only. And as a reminder, a party receiving a copy of an appraisal report in order to satisfy disclosure requirements does not become an intended user of the appraisal unless the appraiser identifies such party as an intended user at the time of the assignments. Third, we state the intended use of the appraisal, which is different than the intended user. And basically, after our discussion today, hopefully you can see the importance of having a thorough understanding of intended use, because that intended use really does drive a lot of the factors into the scope of work. 4, you have to summarize the information sufficient to identify the real estate. And you need to contain the information, documents, and or exhibits sufficient to identify the real estate involved in the appraisal, including physical, legal, and economic property characteristics relative to the assignment. And they go a little further into Advisory Opinion 2 and Advisory Opinion 23 into identifying the real estate. A lot of times they will, a lot of people will identify real estate based on address. However, the address may vary somewhat because the address is generally used by the post office in order to deliver mail, whereas other identifying factors could be tax parcel numbers, could be meets and bounds descriptions from the deed, it could be tax lot and block numbers, but We will actually dive deeper into this during another presentation. Number 5, you need to state the real property interest being appraised. And as you learn in Appraisal 101, there's many different property interests because that's part of the real property or the real estate that we are appraising. And most of the time we're appraising a fee simple interest, which would include the entire bundle of rights. However, there are other interests, including the lease fee, which, as we know, is the interest owned by a landlord with the right to use, generally conveyed to somebody else under the terms of a lease. There's a leasehold interest, which would be the interest held by the tenant when they're leasing a property. They have the right to use a property for a certain period of time. And there's also a life estate, which is very commonly used, where an individual is given the right to use a property for the remainder of their life or the remainder of somebody else's life. Number 6, you need to state the type and definition of value and cite the sources of the definition. Most of the time we will deal with market value. However, there are other types of values. There's liquidation value, which is generally when you're asked to estimate the probable selling price given an abbreviated marketing time. There's also an investment value where you're basically indicating what an investor should pay for a property in order to realize a specific yield that investor would require in order to engage in the investment of a certain piece of real estate. And there's also salvage value, and we see this with a lot of older antiquated properties that may have outlived their useful life, but may have some value in either reclaimed wood. We see this a lot with older church buildings, are a good example where they may salvage some of the reclaimed wood or some of the stained glass, and removing that from the property would yield some sort of value on top of the value of the land. Number 7, we state the effective date of the appraisal and the date of the report. The effective date, as we know, is the date in which the property is being valued. It's basically a snapshot in time along that timeline of what day the value is representing. And most of the time we're asked to provide a current market value, and generally appraisers will indicate that value as of the day they saw the property or as of the day of their physical observation. There are 2 other types of appraisals, effective dates. One would be retrospective, which is if you saw a property today, but somebody wanted to know what the property was worth 5 years ago. You can do that. That's called retrospective valuation. And then there's also a prospective valuation, which is used a lot during new construction or proposed renovations, where a client may ask you, all right, well, I'm going to need to know what this property is going to be worth 6 months from now after they get done building the property, or after they get done, performing certain renovations on the property. And so the effective date of that would be the day that you projected that renovation work or that construction work would be completed. And the report date is actually the day that the report is submitted to the client. So rarely ever will you get an effective date and a report date being the same. Generally, the effective date is the day that the value is good for. The report date is the day that you actually provided the report to the client. And they go into a little bit more detail on that in Advisory Opinions 28 and 29. Number 8, it's important you must summarize the scope of work used to develop the appraisal report. And the scope of work is a very loaded issue, and we're probably going to spend an entire section on scope of work. And this is where summarizing the scope of work includes the disclosure of the research and the analysis performed, and might also include disclosure of the research and analysis that's not performed in order to arrive at a certain conclusion. Number 9, you have to properly disclose any significant real property assistance, if any. And this is where we recognize the significance of the assistance performed by trainees. In Pennsylvania, we have the use of a state-issued trainee checklist, and this checklist actually satisfies the requirement as long as it's included in the report that's transmitted to the client. And basically it shows a bunch of different actions and different duties within the appraisal report, and the trainee will check off which items they either had primary responsibility on or which ones they assisted in. And this is really important because when a trainee is actually, before we get into that, let's talk about there are other people that will provide significant real property assistance. A lot of times, if you are appraising a property type where you may not have thorough competency in order to perform the appraisal, you may disclose to the client that you don't have that competency, but you're going to take certain actions in order to gain that competency. Maybe you will bring in another appraiser who specializes in that property type to work with you on that assignment. Well, also in this section, you would talk about which sections of that report that individual assisted you with or provided the significant assistance with. And this is important because not always do the trainees or anybody performing assistance would sign the appraisal reports. And the thing you need to know about the difference between acknowledging assistance and actually signing the report is that when you're acknowledging the assistance, that person providing the assistance is technically responsible for those items that they provided assistance with. However, if that individual also signs the appraisal report, then it's viewed that that individual is taking responsibility for everything that's in that appraisal report, whether it's just the items that they assisted them with or the items that they did not assist them with. Number 10, it's required that you provide sufficient information to indicate what the appraiser complied with the requirements of Standard 1 by 1, summarizing the appraisal methods and techniques employed, whether it's the sales approach, the income approach, and the cost approach, stating the reasons for excluding the sales, income, and cost approaches if they have not been developed, summarizing the results, analyzing the subject to sales, agreements of sale, options and listings in accordance with Standard 1-5. If such information is unobtainable, a statement on the efforts undertaken by the appraiser to obtain the information is required. If such information is irrelevant, a statement acknowledging the existence of the information and citing its lack of relevance is required. This is very important because this has been part of USPAP now for several years. What they had an issue with was the fact of property flipping or properties that sold prior to the effective date of the appraisal report. However, there's no reconciliation between a prior transfer or prior sale of the property and the value that the property was being brought in at the time of the appraisal. So the asterisks are in place because generally in restricted appraisal reports, you're supposed to just state certain pieces of information. Whereas in an appraisal report, it should be summarized or described. However, when it comes to this, to the recent sales history, it's very important that it's analyzed no matter which reporting option that you are presenting. And that's because it's very important that if the property is sold within the last 3 years or property is transferred in the last 3 years, that you perform a full analysis of any of those transfers. You don't just state whether the property sold on this date for this much, recorded in this deed. You need to contact the property owners. You need to contact the agents involved. You need to try to understand the conditions behind that sale and whether that sale was indicative of market value. And if that sales price is different than the market value that you're determining in that appraisal report, there should be a reconciliation painting a picture as to why the value is different as of the effective date of the appraisal. And finally, stating the opinion of the value opinions and conclusions, and summarizing the information analysis and reasoning that supports the analysis, opinions, and conclusions, including reconciliation of the data of the three approaches. So you need to reconcile all the approaches that are performed. You need to reconcile whether the market value to any recent sales within the last 3 years. Number 11, you need to state the use of the real estate existing as of the effective date and the use of the real estate reflected in the appraisal. And 12, when an opinion of highest and best use was developed by the appraiser, state that the opinion and summarize the support and rationale for that opinion. But wait, there's also 2 more items. Number 13, you must clearly and conspicuously state all extraordinary assumptions and hypothetical conditions, and state that their use may affect the assignment results. As we learned in Appraiser 101, the difference between an extraordinary assumption and the hypothetical condition is based on what is known as a fact and what you're making an assumption for. The extraordinary assumption, the definition of the extraordinary assumption is an assignment-specific assumption that's being made that if found to be not correct could impact the assignment results. A good couple of examples of an extraordinary assumption is one, if you're only asked to do an exterior only appraisal and you don't get a chance to see the inside of the property. So therefore you have to make a reasonable attempt to gather as much information as you can as to what the interior of the property looked like at that time. And then you would have to make an extraordinary assumption that that information is correct. And then you would have to indicate that if that assumption is later found to be incorrect, then you reserve the right to, or that the assignment results may be impacted. Also, if you're providing a prospective valuation and you're giving a date of completion for construction 6 months into the future, you don't know for a fact whether that construction is going to be completed by that date or not. So you're making an assumption that the construction or the renovation work would be completed by that date, and if it's not completed by that date, it may affect the assignment results. A hypothetical condition is different than an extraordinary assumption because these are items that we know to be contrary to fact, but for the purpose of the appraisal report, we're assuming or we're making them true. So this is if somebody wants a current valuation on a proposed building that has not yet been constructed, and you go out to the property and you do the site visit and you see that there's a giant hole in the ground where the building will one day be, but you know it's not there today, but the client wants to know what that property's worth today as if it was there, well, you know for a fact it's not there. But for the purpose of this appraisal report, you're going to make it there in order to value the property. That would be a hypothetical condition. And finally, number 14, you need to include a side certification in accordance to standard rule 2-3. And in that certification, it's also required to include any prior services performed on the subject property within the 3 years preceding the agreement to perform the appraisal, performing this assignment. So that's all you have to disclose. You don't have to disclose who you did the assignment for. You don't have to disclose how much you appraised the property for. In fact, it might be actually be a violation of the confidentiality rule if you do indicate any of that information. So therefore, all you're required is to disclose is if you actually performed any appraisal related services on the property within 3 years of the agreement to perform a specific assignment. And there we go. That's a quick recap of what we went over in USPAP Extravaganza Part 1. We will go ahead and hopefully keep this up monthly and each month provide additional information on the Uniform Standards Professional Appraisal Practice, diving deeper into some of the rules and some of the advisory opinions. If you have any questions, please reach out. And thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.